Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the channel. At UFC 283, Jamal Hill defeated Glover Teixeira to become the UFC undisputed light heavyweight champion. And in the co-main event, you had Brandon Moreno defeating Devison Figueiredo to become the undisputed flyweight champion. And this video is going to be what's next for both Jamal Hill and Brandon Moreno. And I know some of the matchups seem kind of obvious, but not only am I going to briefly discuss each matchup, I'm also going to give you an early prediction for all the matchups that I'm going to give you in this video. Now, before I get into anything, I did an entire post-fight live stream. It's roughly an hour and a half long. I discussed Jamal Hill versus Glover Teixeira in depth. I discussed Brandon Moreno versus Devison Figueiredo in depth. I will link that down in the description if you guys want to go check that out after this, because I'm not going to talk about the fights, in super high detail in this video. But first off, let's start with Jamal Hill. He becomes the light heavyweight champion at UFC 283. And what a crazy turn of events, because, a month ago, Jamal Hill probably isn't fighting for a belt till at least 2024 at best, if he's able to continue to win. And because of that crazy turn of events where Jiri Prochazka injures his shoulder, then you have a Magomed Ankalaev Jan Blachowicz title fight that ends in a draw. And then Dana White, the night of UFC 282, says, you know what? The main event of UFC 283 is going to be Jamal Hill versus Glover Teixeira for the undisputed title. Now Jamal Hill is the light heavyweight champion. He beat the brakes off of Glover Teixeira. He won all 5 rounds. It was a dominant win. And I feel like a lot of people think they already know the next matchup for Jamal Hill. And it's going to kill me to say it, but I have a feeling that it's probably not going to happen. But the first matchup for Jamal Hill I would like to see, and that I think is possible. All these matchups are possible, but I'm going to tell you what I think actually happens. But I'm going to give all the options for both Jamal Hill and Brandon Moreno. But the first matchup is Jamal Hill versus Jiri Prochazka. If you watched the video I did earlier this month, top 10 fights I want to see in 2023 in the UFC, on that list was Jamal Hill versus Jiri Prochazka. And it makes a lot of sense because Jiri Prochazka was the undisputed champion. He won at UFC 275 last year. He injures his shoulder. He vacates the belt. And now Jamal Hill's the champion. It only makes sense they fight each other. And I would kill to see that fight. And I would absolutely love to see that fight. And I hope that this is the fight that comes to fruition because Jiri Prochazka never lost his belt. So why not book this fight? It's a stylistically fan-friendly matchup. It would be absolute amazing. It would be such an amazing matchup in the light heavyweight division. And, I would love to see this matchup. But unfortunately, I don't believe it's going to happen because Jiri Prochazka injured his shoulder. It was such a significant injury that the UFC, Jiri Prochazka, talked amongst themselves, and they decided that Jiri Prochazka was going to vacate his belt. If he was able to fight in mid-2023, why would he even vacate his belt? We have champions that hang on to belts for over a year all the time, sometimes longer than that. And we make an interim belt and then we wait for that champion to return. So I have a hard time believing, and when they initially talked about it, they acted as if Jiri Prochazka would be out for all of 2023. But if this fight does come to fruition, I'm going to give you a quick breakdown of this fight. This is an amazing matchup. Both guys, elite level strikers. Jiri Prochazka has never been in a boring fight. He fights like an absolute wild man. The win over Volkan Ozdemir in his UFC debut. The win over Dominic Reyes, even though it hasn't aged that well because Dominic Reyes is now a punching bag. And then the come-from-behind victory against Glover Teixeira in one of the best fights I've ever seen. This matchup would be absolutely amazing because both guys are strikers. Jamal Hill's on a 4-fight win streak. He beats Glover Teixeira and beat him up pretty badly, dominated him for 5 rounds. The fight before that, he TKO'd Thiago Santos. Fight before that, he brutally KO'd Johnny Walker. Fight before that, he brutally KO'd Jimmy Crute. It just makes perfect sense. It's a super exciting matchup. And to see Jamal Hill evolve from fight to fight and improve vastly from fight to fight, and he showed in the Glover Teixeira fight, he's super well-rounded. But I don't think in a Jiri Prochazka fight he would mix in the grappling. I think this would be primarily a striking match. And it would all come down to whether or not Jiri Prochazka wading in to danger with his hands low, does Jamal Hill put him to sleep? Up until this point, Jiri Prochazka has shown he has a granite chin. And, it's crazy. Eventually it's going to give out. But if I have to give an early prediction for Jamal Hill versus Yuri Prochazka, I am going with Yuri Prochazka. I just think he's an absolute wild man. I think Jamal Hill, even though his offensive striking is vastly improving and looks so good against Glover Teixeira, the defensive striking leaves a lot to be desired. Glover landed a lot of hooks in that fight, and I think Yuri Prochazka has nuclear power as well. He has one punch KO power. He's super dynamic. He's throwing spinning techniques. He's super unorthodox. He's hard to hit. And I just think you have a young, fast Yuri Prochazka with an unlimited gas tank, just, marching forward, pressuring you. I think he's going to clip Jamal Hill and probably finish him. And this is the fight that I want to see. If it's up to me, this is the fight that I'm seeing. The earliest possible scenario we would see this would be like summer, fall. And I think if Yuri can come back, even if it's not till September, October, I say we wait and we do Jamal Hill versus Yuri Prochazka in September, October. But unfortunately, I do not believe this is what's going to happen. Yuri would have not vacated the belt. And this wasn't just solely Yuri's decision. He talked it over with the UFC, with Dana White, all that good stuff. They decided for him to vacate the belt. Again, that leads me to believe this is a very significant injury. And I know Yuri Prochazka is a wild man. He locks himself in rooms with no food, and he's an absolute samurai. He just had surgery on his shoulder. And supposedly the injury was super significant. So I feel like the UFC, the doctors all knew that Yuri's probably going to be out for a year, and that's why they decided to have him vacate the belt. Because imagine, from a promotional standpoint, this would be even a bigger fight. You have Jamal Hill would be an interim champion in this scenario versus the undisputed champion Yuri Prochazka. The fight would be even bigger. So I just don't think this is going to happen. I think a lot of people are expecting this to be next, and unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen. So if that's not going to happen, what's next for Jamal Hill? Well, the light heavyweight division is kind of in disarray. It's kind of coming around that corner and starting to kind of fix itself, because before, it didn't have a champion. Then you had a championship fight that ended in a draw after the champion vacated his belt. So it was an absolute disaster. But now we're starting to get to some point of normalcy with Jamal Hill as the champion. And you start looking through the division. Number 1 is Yuri Prochazka. I just discussed him. Number 2, Glover Teixeira is retired. Number 3, Magomed Ankalaev just fought in December against Jan Blachowicz, who's number 4. Then you have number 5, Alexander Rakic. Injury, he's injured and he's coming off a loss. Anthony Smith coming off an injury and also coming off a loss. Jamal Hill was number 7. He is now the champion. Nikita Krylov, I think he's fighting Ryan Spann next, if I'm not mistaken. He shouldn't be in title discussion. Paul Craig on a loss. Volkan Ozdemir, I think, is coming off a win over Paul Craig, but he's not fighting for a title. So the only real options, you go through that list, there's only 2 options for Jamal Hill if it's not Yuri Prochazka. Actually, there's 3 options. Actually, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I didn't name one of the options. Number 3, Magomed Ankalaev. I think the UFC will most likely do Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev. And the reason I believe this will happen is because at UFC 282, you had Magomed Ankalaev versus Jan Blachowicz. This fight ended in a draw, but the majority of people felt that Magomed Ankalaev won that fight. I thought a draw was a fair scorecard. I thought you could make the case that Jan Blachowicz won the first 3 rounds, and I think you can make the case that Magomed Ankalaev won rounds 4 and round 5, and 5 was a 10-8 round for Magomed Ankalaev. So I have no problem with the draw, but you can't deny the fact in the 4th and 5th round, Jan Blachowicz got dominated, and most people scored, I think it was the first round. I think I personally scored the first round for Magomed Ankalaev. So therefore, most people, including myself, believe that Ankalaev won the fight against Jan Blachowicz. And this fight just makes a lot of sense. Jamal Hill just fought, obviously, at UFC 283. Magomed Ankalaev just fought last month. They're on the same schedule. And you could do Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev in, June, July, August. And then let's say Yuri Prochazka isn't going to return until early next year, early 2024. The winner of that fight would be ready for Yuri Prochazka in early 2024. So I think this is the fight the UFC most likely makes. I don't think they give it to Jan Blachowicz. On top of most people believing Jan Blachowicz lost the fight, he's also getting up there in age. I don't think the UFC wants Jan Blachowicz to go out there and take the belt off Jamal Hill, who's a younger guy coming off Dana White's Contender Series. I don't think they're going to give Blachowicz a title shot. I think they're going to give him a different fight. So I think they do Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev. If I had gun to my head, I say Jamal Hill, Magomed Ankalaev in June, July, or August. But if I had to guess, I'm going to say Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev in June of this year. I think that's the fight the UFC makes next. Now, another wild card matchup that I wanted to, or actually before I get into that wild card matchup, which a lot of people are going to talk about this matchup I'm going to get to here in a second. But before I get into that, I want to give you my early prediction for Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev. My early prediction for that fight, I'm going Jamal Hill. People hear Magomed Ankalaev and they think he's some elite grappler. Glover Teixeira has better top game than Magomed Ankalaev, okay? Magomed Ankalaev is primarily a striker. I'm going Jamal Hill for my early prediction. If Magomed Ankalaev beats Jamal Hill, it will be with his striking. It will be with his kicks. But I think Jamal Hill, his well-roundedness, his takedown defense. You know, Ankalaev couldn't get Jan Blachowicz down in the first, second, or third round. And look what Glover Teixeira did to Jan Blachowicz. Easily took him down and easily dominated him. So I don't think, I know MMA math doesn't necessarily work, but you can look at certain fights to determine their skill sets. Glover Teixeira is easily taking down Jan Blachowicz and not easily taking down Jamal Hill. Meanwhile, Magomed Ankalaev is having trouble taking down Jan Blachowicz. And I know you could say improvement, all that stuff, but I think Jamal Hill can stuff the takedowns. I think it will be primarily on the feet, and I think Jamal Hill has the better striking. But it would not shock me if Magomed Ankalaev won that fight with his striking ability. But I think Jamal Hill is just a step ahead of Magomed Ankalaev in the striking, especially with the hands. I think Ankalaev probably has a little bit better kicks, but Jamal Hill is vastly evolving. If you watch my post-fight at all, I talked about the kicks that he used against Glover Teixeira. So I think that's the fight that happens, and I'm probably taking Jamal Hill probably by like a third or fourth round finish. Jamal Hill also showed that he has cardio. He took the Glover Teixeira fight on 1 month's notice. Imagine what his cardio is going to look like when he has a full training camp for Magomed Ankalaev. So I'm going Jamal Hill in that one. The other wild card matchup for Jamal Hill that I'm not going to spend too much time on because I don't believe it's going to happen, but it would be incredible and it would be a hell of a storyline. That is Jamal Hill versus Alex Pereira, the middleweight champion. Alex Pereira is massive for the middleweight division, okay? He looked huge in his fight at UFC 281 where he beat Israel Adesanya and took the middleweight title from him. Also, Alex Pereira's coach and training partner happens to be Glover Teixeira. Also, when you look at Alex Pereira versus the middleweight division, he doesn't match up very well with guys like Robert Whittaker, Marvin Vettori. The wrestling lacks of Alex Pereira. And Jamal Hill is not a guy that's going to go out there and offensively wrestle. If I'm Alex Pereira, I am begging for the Jamal Hill fight. And the reason I don't think this happens is because the Israel Adesanya-Alex Pereira 2 fight is just too big for the UFC to pass up. But if Pereira fights Adesanya, let's say they end up booking it for April or May, if he goes out there and beats Israel Adesanya again, there's a chance if Jamal Hill doesn't have a fight booked, he could call out Jamal Hill and you could see Jamal Hill versus Alex Pereira next. And honestly, as far as an early prediction for that fight, I lean Alex Pereira. It's going to be primarily striking. I don't know if Jamal Hill's going to mix in the offensive grappling, but he should. I think Jamal Hill could out-grapple him, and maybe that's what he does. But if it stays striking, it's hard to doubt Alex Pereira. I think he probably KOs Jamal Hill. As crazy as that sounds, if Jamal Hill does not mix in the grappling, I would pick Alex Pereira in that fight. But I don't think that fight is going to happen just because the Israel Adesanya fight is too big, and that's probably not happening till April or May at the earliest. Okay, again, just to summarize that, I think we get Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev in May or June of this year. Moving on to Brandon Moreno. Brandon Moreno put on an excellent performance against Devison Figueiredo, outclassed him, won every single round, punched him. I think it was a left hand. The thumb went right in the eye, but it was illegal. It was legal. It was a knuckle in the eye. Closed the eye up. Devison Figueiredo was not able to continue. And there's only one fight. There's only one fight for Brandon Moreno. And I know some people were saying we need to see a 5th fight between the two. Brandon Moreno won every single round. And it was pretty obvious that he won every single round. And he was a step ahead of Devison Figueiredo. And Devison Figueiredo said he's now going to 135. So that fight's off the table. That fight is not happening. If you look at the UFC rankings for the division, there's only one fight for Brandon Moreno. And that is Brandon Moreno versus Alexandre Pantoja. 3, but they would probably call it 2, but I don't know because Alexandre Pantoja fought Brandon Moreno in The Ultimate Fighter, finished him, but that's considered an exhibition. That's not actually considered a fight. And then they fought one time in the UFC that's officially an actual fight, I guess if you want to call it, on their professional records, because the Ultimate Fighter fights do not count. So it's a trilogy, it's a rematch, whatever you want to call it. The fight is Brandon Moreno versus Alexandre Pantoja. This is the only fight. There's no other fight that's acceptable within the flyweight division. Pantoja has earned this title shot. He has 2 wins over Brandon Moreno. His last fight, he looked like an absolute savage against Alex Perez at UFC 277. Went out there, walked him down, eventually, creates a scramble. The striking looked good, but then he creates a scramble, gets on his back, submits him via neck crank. The fight before that, he defeats Brandon Royval via rear naked choke, another top contender. The fight before that, he beat Manel Kopp, who's an up-and-coming guy who looks very good in the weight class right now. Deserves the title shot. This is the only fight to make. And what an amazing story it'll be, considering, they fought back in 2018 and they fought back in 2016. To have Brandon Moreno be the undisputed flyweight champion and have Alexandre Pantoja have 2 wins over him. And then on top of that, Alexandre Pantoja looks better than ever. He looked better than ever against Alex Perez. He looked better than ever against Brandon Royval. And he's currently, you look at the rankings, I think he's currently ranked number 2. But my guess is he'll move up to that number 1 slot, most likely, after they fix the rankings probably tomorrow or so. But either way, he's going to be ranked number 1 or number 2 in the division. But they might remove Figgy from the rankings altogether because he said he's moving up to 135. That remains to be seen. Nonetheless, that is the only fight to make. And what an incredible matchup that is. If you watched my video, I did a video where I said every champion that will lose their belt in 2023. And I'll link that video down in the description. But not only did I try to predict who would have the belt at the end of 2023, I tried to predict, obviously, with predicting who's going to have the belt at the end, I tried to guess how each division would play out through the course of 2023. And I said I thought Brandon Moreno would beat Figgy at UFC 283 and then fight Alexandre Pantoja the middle or fall of 2023 and lose to Alexandre Pantoja. But honestly, that performance at 283 is changing my mind a little bit. And I mean, this is an amazing fight. Pantoja, the striking is evolved. The jiu-jitsu is unbelievable. The offensive submission game is unbelievable. The fact that he has 2 wins over Brandon Moreno, it's hard not to pick him. And he's in the prime of his career at 32 years old. And Brandon Moreno, it's hard to believe he's only 29 years old. But Brandon Moreno is looking better than ever. And, it seems like every single time out, Brandon Moreno is vastly improved. So for this video, I'm actually going to change my early prediction, and I'm going Brandon Moreno to beat Alexandre Pantoja in a trilogy fight or rematch, whatever you want to call it. I just think Brandon Moreno is evolved so much and has vastly improved his skills. And you could make a case since he returned to the UFC in 2019 that he has not lost a fight in the UFC, because the only loss he has is against Figgy at UFC 270, and it was a split decision. I thought Brandon Moreno won that fight. But nonetheless, it's a loss, but he still looked incredible in that fight. He looked incredible in the Kai Kara-France fight. And Kai Kara-France was looking better than ever going into that fight. And then he beats Figgy at 283. It's hard for me to doubt Brandon Moreno, especially another 6 months down the road. I think he's going to evolve even more. The striking looks top-notch. The wrestling and scrambling ability looks top-notch. Even his jiu-jitsu, especially in that second fight where he outclassed Figgy and finished him via rear naked choke, looked amazing in that fight. So for my early prediction, I'm going Brandon Moreno. I'm going to probably pick Brandon Moreno probably by decision. Pantoja's never been finished in his MMA career. He's 5 losses. All 5 of them are by decision. So I'm going Brandon Moreno in that fight as an early prediction. As always, when these fights get made and we get closer to those fights, I will make a full breakdown and prediction and give my official prediction for each fight. But I think Brandon Moreno, Alexandre Pantoja will happen next. And I think this will probably happen, I would say May, June, July. I think that's when this fight will happen. And they may do a pay-per-view in Mexico. There's a chance. I mean, Brandon Moreno went to Brazil to fight Figgy. There's a chance. They've been wanting to do a pay-per-view down in Mexico. It's all going to hinge on the fact, does the UFC believe Brandon Moreno is a big enough star to potentially headline a UFC pay-per-view in Mexico? They could stack the card. Maybe if Yair wins an interim belt, maybe they could try to get Volk when he goes back down, maybe to fight in Mexico against Jair. Obviously, we're playing hypotheticals there, but I could see Brandon Moreno versus Pantoja. I think it's going to happen sometime late spring, early summer, or maybe even the middle of summer. And I'm really looking forward to that fight. So just to summarize this whole video, Jamal Hill versus Magomed Ankalaev, most likely in June. Brandon Moreno versus Alexandre Pantoja, most likely somewhere May, June, July. Let me know what you guys think of these matchups, and let me know what you think of the early predictions as well. I'm curious who you guys would pick in these fights. And also let me know, which of these fights would you prefer? Like, if in an ideal, perfect world, which of these fights for each champion would you like to happen next? So let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.